before the world knew them as the Lost Battalion. The men of Major Charles Whittlesey's command were simply American soldiers marching into the unknown. Many had come from New York City's crowded neighborhoods, immigrants, factory workers, laborers, ordinary men suddenly thrust into an extraordinary war. The 77th Division, known as the Metropolitan Division, reflected the diversity of early 20th century America. More than 40 languages could be heard between the barracks. But when they marched as one. When they arrived in France in 1918, the reality of the Great War hit them with full force. Entire forests were reduced to splintered stumps. Villages were nothing but shattered stone. Trenches carved the countryside into a maze of mud and wire. Artillery thundered constantly, never allowing silence long enough to feel at ease. For many of the young Americans, it was the first time they realized this war was unlike anything their nation had fought before. As the Allies prepared for the massive Meuse-Argonne offensive, Whittlesey and his men were ordered to push deep into the Argonne forest, break through German defenses, and keep advancing, no matter the resistance. Commanders insisted the attack had to move quickly. Other American units were supposed to advance alongside Whittlesey's flanks, protecting his position as the battalion pushed through the dense terrain. At dawn, on October 2nd, Whittlesey's force stepped into the forest. The air was damp, heavy with mist, and the thick underbrush made every movement slow. German machine gun fire erupted almost immediately, tearing through branches and tree trunks. Yet the battalion pressed forward yard by yard, fighting their way through pockets of resistance. By afternoon, they reached a deep ravine surrounded by steep ridges and tangled vegetation. Thinking their flanks were still moving forward, Whittlesey set up a defensive position. But elsewhere in the forest, the attack had stalled. The units meant to protect his sides had been pinned down, or forced back by intense German fire. Whittlesey received none of this information. His runners, young soldiers carrying messages through enemy territory, did not return. Some were captured, others were killed. Communication with the rest of the division fell silent. By nightfall, German troops had quietly slipped behind them, sealing off every path of retreat. The battalion, now unknowingly deep behind enemy lines, was encircled. As darkness filled the ravine, the men realized their food and water supplies were dangerously low. The nearest stream, their only water source, was exposed to enemy snipers. Soldiers who tried to reach it were shot down before they could return. German patrols whispered in the night, testing the American defenses, sometimes calling out in broken English to lure them into revealing their positions. The men stayed silent, clutching their rifles, waiting for dawn. Major Whittlesey, calm but fully aware of the danger, prepared his men for what might come next. He did not yet know how isolated they were. He did not know that more than 500 American troops were now trapped in a tightening German noose. But he understood one thing clearly. They would hold the ravine until they were ordered otherwise. At first light, the truth would hit all of them at once. They were alone, they were surrounded, and the battle for survival was only beginning. When the morning of October 3rd crept into the ravine, the men of Whittlesey's battalion awoke to a chilling realization. The forest around them was unnaturally quiet. No friendly gunfire crackled on their flanks. No signs of advancing American forces emerged from the trees. Instead, scattered shapes moved along the ridgelines, German scouts watching them from above. It took only minutes for the first attack to begin. Machine guns roared from concealed nests, stitching the ground with bursts of fire. Rifles cracked from the shadows. The Americans scrambled into position, returning fire as best they could. But the high ground belonged to the enemy. Every movement drew bullets. Every shout echoed through the ravine, like a warning of the battle still to come. By mid-morning, Whittlesey finally understood the full extent of their isolation. The Germans had closed in on every route of escape. His men were trapped in a narrow, uneven pocket of forest with no steady supply of food, water, ammunition, or medical support. He ordered his officers to take stock. The numbers were grim. Most soldiers had only a handful of cartridges left. Some had no rations at all. Many had begun the day already exhausted, having slept in the dirt while listening to enemy patrols whisper in the darkness. The wounded took up positions behind whatever cover they could find. Medics moved among them with limited supplies, bandaging wounds with torn cloth, offering morphine to the worst cases, and doing everything possible to keep the injured alive. But each hour brought new casualties. German snipers and machine guns targeted anyone who exposed themselves, even for a moment. A man raising his head to get a clearer shot could be eliminated instantly. At noon, the Germans intensified the pressure. Mortar shells crashed into the ravine, sending debris raining down and echoing across the trees. Each explosion shook the ground beneath the Americans' feet. Some soldiers instinctively curled into the earth, clutching their helmets, waiting for the barrage to end. Others held their rifles tight, determined to resist even as smoke filled their lungs. Shouts of "Medic!" echoed through the chaos. Yet despite everything, the line held. Whittlesey refused to surrender. The concept wasn't even part of his thinking. As long as his men could fight, as long as they could return a single shot, they would stand their ground. Reports from the front made it clear his determination was contagious. Even the youngest privates, boys barely out of high school, stood firm against repeated attacks, firing carefully to conserve ammunition. But courage couldn't fill empty stomachs. By late afternoon, hunger gnawed at every man in the ravine. Many had not eaten since the previous day, and those who tried to chew the last scraps of their rations found them dry and nearly impossible to swallow. Water was an even greater crisis. The stream near their position was the only source, but attempting to reach it meant stepping directly into German guns. Several soldiers died trying. Their bodies lay close to the water's edge, a silent warning to the others. As evening descended once again over the Argonne forest, the battalion faced another long night and morale wavered. The forest was filled with eerie sounds, the distant rumble of artillery, occasional bursts of gunfire, and the low groans of the wounded. Some men whispered prayers. Others cursed into the darkness, trying to mask their fear. A few sat in stunned silence, staring at nothing, their minds retreating inward as the weight of hopelessness pressed on them. Whittlesey walked among his troops with a lantern, its dim glow illuminating tired faces, streaked with mud and sweat. He spoke softly, offering calm reassurance, even as worry gnawed at him. The Germans had sent a message earlier that afternoon, demanding his surrender. He ignored it. To him, surrender meant exposing his men to an uncertain fate, imprisonment, humiliation, or worse. He believed rescue was still possible. Somewhere beyond the trees, he trusted, American forces were still advancing. But deep down, even he wondered how long they could survive. Shortly after midnight, the Germans attempted another assault, creeping toward the ravine under the cover of darkness. They fired flares into the sky, lighting the forest in harsh white light. The Americans responded with a blast of rifle fire that sent the attackers scrambling back into the shadows. For a moment, the ravine was quiet again. Then, from the far end of their position, a young soldier shouted. He had spotted movement, an entire German detachment preparing another push. The long ordeal was far from over, and the men of the Lost Battalion were about to face their most desperate hours yet. The morning of October 4th began with a shock that none of Whittlesey's men could have imagined. After 2 days of brutal encirclement, they heard the distant thrum of aircraft engines. At first, the sound filled the ravine with hope. American planes had been scouring the forest for lost units, and the battalion believed rescue was finally close. Men lifted their heads, waving scraps of cloth, shouting to the sky, desperate to be recognized. Then the truth hit them like a hammer. The incoming planes were American, yes, but they believed the battalion was German, and they were lining up for an attack. A moment later, bombs whistled downward. The first explosion tore through the treetops, showering the ravine with splintered branches and metal fragments. Men dove to the ground, covering their heads as fire and smoke engulfed their positions. Another bomb landed near their makeshift medical station, scattering the wounded and sending medics scrambling for cover. Soldiers screamed warnings toward the sky, but the pilots could not hear them. From above, the ravine looked like a nest of enemy positions surrounded by German forces. So the planes made another pass, and another. Whittlesey watched helplessly as the very army he trusted to save them unleashed devastation on his trapped men. Each blast shook the earth. Each plume of smoke marked another set of casualties. When the bombing run finally ended, the ravine was choked with dust. The cries of the wounded filled the air. Some men stared upward in disbelief, unable to comprehend what had just happened. It was one thing to suffer under German fire, but to be struck by their own side, that was a blow that cut deeper than any injury. Then, out of the smoky sky, something unexpected appeared. A small carrier pigeon spiraling downward from one of the aircraft. It landed near a cluster of soldiers who cautiously retrieved it. Attached to its leg was a small metal capsule. Inside the capsule was a message from the pilot stating they were preparing to bomb again unless they received confirmation that friendly forces were present. Whittlesey immediately dictated a response. His handwriting was tight. Urgent. We are along the road parallel to the ravine. For heaven's sake, stop it. The pigeon, named Cher Ami, was released at once. She lifted into the air, weaving through gunfire and smoke as German soldiers tried to shoot her down. Severely wounded but still flying, she eventually reached the American lines, delivering the message that saved the battalion from further friendly fire. But the relief was short-lived. The Germans seized on the chaos and launched another attack just after noon. Machine gun bursts ripped across the ravine. Grenades exploded among the foxholes. Waves of German infantry surged forward, trying to overrun the battered Americans. The men fought with everything they had left. Some fired single, careful shots to conserve ammunition. Others used captured German weapons when their own rifles jammed or ran dry. Even the wounded who could still hold a gun joined the defense. The attackers reached the edge of the American line, but the battalion refused to yield. Hand-to-hand combat broke out in the tangled underbrush. Mud, blood, fists, bayonets, sheer desperation. The men of the 308th fought like cornered wolves, refusing to let the enemy break through. Eventually, the Germans pulled back, leaving bodies scattered across the slopes. Silence returned, but it was not peaceful. It was the silence of men pushed to the limits of endurance. Food was gone. Water had become a luxury none could afford. Some soldiers risked crawling to the stream during lulls in the fighting, returning with only a few swallows of filthy water. Others sucked moisture from leaves or chewed on damp soil just to ease the burning in their throats. The wounded suffered even more. Medics could offer little beyond words of comfort, knowing their supplies were depleted. Several men died simply because their bodies could no longer fight dehydration or infection. Whittlesey gathered his remaining officers for a grim assessment. Ammunition was dangerously low. Nearly 1/3 of the battalion was dead, wounded, or missing. The German encirclement was tightening, and another surrender demand had just arrived. This one more forceful, promising honorable treatment if the Americans laid down their arms immediately. Whittlesey didn't hesitate. He brushed the message aside. He would not surrender. He would not abandon the wounded. He would not allow the Germans to claim victory over his men. Word of his resolve rippled through the ravine. Even the most exhausted soldiers felt a spark of determination return. Their situation was nearly hopeless, but their leader refused to break, and as long as he stood firm, they would too. That night, the forest felt colder than ever. Fog curled around the trees, and the moon cast faint light across the battered landscape. The men lay in silence, conserving their strength, listening for any signs of movement in the darkness. Every shift of the wind, every crack of a branch made hearts race. They had survived friendly fire. They had repelled wave after wave of German attacks. But the worst days were still ahead. Dawn would bring new dangers, and the Lost Battalion was running out of time. By the dawn of October 6th, the Lost Battalion had been trapped for days. The ravine had become a graveyard of shattered trees, smoldering craters, and wounded men clinging to life. Whittlesey's troops were exhausted, starving, dehydrated, and battered by relentless German attacks. Yet somehow they still held their ground. The Germans, frustrated by the battalion's refusal to surrender, prepared for another assault. This one was meant to break the Americans once and for all. At first light, enemy troops moved quietly through the fog, preparing to strike from multiple angles. The forest was again filled with the crackle of rifles and the hammering of machine guns. Grenades arced through the air, exploding among the scattered foxholes. German mortars pounded the ridge, showering dirt and debris over the American defenders. But the men of the 308th fought back with a stubborn fury that defied their terrible condition. Some fired from behind fallen logs, their hands trembling from hunger. Others lay wounded, but still tried to reload rifles for their comrades. The battalion's position shrank with each attack, but the Americans refused to yield even a single inch. As the battle raged, American command finally pieced together what had happened. Reports from captured Germans combined with sightings from reconnaissance aircraft confirmed the truth. Whittlesey's men were deep behind enemy lines, surrounded, but still fighting with unbelievable resilience. The realization sent shockwaves through the chain of command. A rescue effort had to begin immediately. Orders went out. Units from the 308th and nearby regiments were to push forward, break through the German encirclement, and reach the ravine at all costs. It would not be easy. The Germans had fortified the surrounding hills, dug new machine gun positions, and deployed fresh troops specifically to crush the Lost Battalion before rescue could arrive. On October 7th, the rescue force began its assault. The forest shook with the roar of American artillery, pounding German defenses and carving paths through the dense undergrowth. Infantry pushed forward, fighting from tree to tree, dealing with ambushes, snipers, and trench lines hidden in the thick brush. Progress was slow, and every gain cost blood. But the Americans were determined. Word had spread through the ranks that hundreds of their comrades were trapped and still holding out. Soldiers pushed harder, fought fiercer, refusing to let the Lost Battalion fall. Back in the ravine, Whittlesey's men endured their final, most agonizing day. Many could barely stand. Others lay motionless, their energy gone. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Some soldiers picked up rocks and debris, ready to fight with their bare hands if necessary. The wounded begged for water the battalion did not have. Desperation hung heavy in the air. Shortly after noon, the Germans launched yet another attack, hoping to crush the remaining resistance before American reinforcements arrived. They stormed the ridges, firing down into the ravine. The Americans met them with everything they had left. Smoke, screams, and gunfire tore through the forest. For a moment, it seemed they might finally be overrun. Then it happened. A distant shout echoed through the trees, not German, but American. Moments later, gunfire erupted on the enemy's flank. Rescue troops had broken through. German soldiers, realizing they were now caught between two forces, began to retreat. Some fled deeper into the forest. Others surrendered, dropping their rifles and raising their hands. The pressure that had crushed the battalion for days finally lifted. American reinforcements rushed into the ravine, stunned by the sight before them. Men who had once marched proudly into battle were now gaunt, filthy, and barely conscious. Some cried when they saw their rescuers. Others simply collapsed from exhaustion. The wounded were carried out on improvised stretchers. Medics scrambled to stabilize those who had hung on through sheer willpower. Survivors looked around, searching for friends who would never rise again. When the fighting ended, only 194 soldiers walked out of that ravine, under their own power. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. The cost of their stand was enormous, but their refusal to surrender had become a symbol of unbreakable American resolve. Major Whittlesey, who had held firm through every moment of terror, was hailed as a hero. But the weight of those days never left him. The memories of the dead, the wounded, and the impossible choices he had been forced to make haunted him for the rest of his life. Though he was awarded the Medal of Honor, he spoke rarely of the battle, choosing instead to honor the men who had stood beside him. In the decades that followed, the story of the Lost Battalion became a powerful chapter of American history, a reminder of the courage found not in grand victories, but in impossible situations. It is a story of men who were abandoned by circumstance, yet refused to surrender. Men who held the line in a ravine deep in the Argonne, not for glory, but for one another. Their stand remains one of the most extraordinary acts of endurance and determination ever recorded in American warfare. And long after the last survivor passed, their voices, their sacrifice, and their unwavering spirit echo through the pages of history.